These are the hills of the Valley of Achor. It is a barren, quiet stretch of desert near Jericho, but in the biblical narrative, it carries two contradictory identities. The valley first appears in the book of Joshua, chapter 7, as a site of catastrophic failure following the conquest of Jericho. It was here that a man named Achan was executed for violating a divine ban on wartime spoils. In this initial context, the valley is a monument to absolute retributive justice. But the timeline shifts roughly 600 years later to the prophecy of Hosea. Speaking to a nation on the edge of another collapse, God points back to these same desert coordinates, announcing a new exodus where he will transform this specific terrain. He declares that the Valley of Achor will become a door of hope. This creates a glaring theological tension. How does a location defined by lethal execution become the designated gateway for restoration? Reconciling this requires looking past the surface of the stories and analyzing the mechanics of hidden sin, federal accountability, and the specific role of discipline within the Old Testament covenant. To understand Achan's crisis, we have to look at the Old Covenant structure. Israel did not function as a collection of isolated individuals, but as a single, unified entity. In Joshua 7, Achan violates the herem, the ban on spoils. He steals gold, silver, and a garment, burying them deep inside his private tent. In this network, Achan's act wasn't just a personal failing. A single node turned dark. This unaddressed sin acts as a contagion, slowly infecting surrounding nodes, compromising the whole. But secrecy is an illusion. Be sure your sin will find you out. This divine exposure forces a confrontation. The community is forced to deal with a reality they can no longer hide. Under this covenant, the attempt to harbor hidden sin leads inevitably to systemic national corruption. Modern assumptions about justice often focus strictly on the individual perpetrator. But look at God's response to Joshua. He does not say Achan has sinned. He says Israel has sinned. This is corporate solidarity. In this framework, the guilt of one member strips the spiritual covering and protection from the entire body. This dynamic is even more acute within the community's leadership, a concept known as federal headship. Leaders act as federal heads for the people. Because they hold the office of representation, their actions carry a multiplied weight. This weight is quantified in the laws of Leviticus 4. If a common member sins, they bring a goat. But if the high priest sins, the law requires a young bull, the most costly sacrifice, because his transgression brings guilt on the entire nation. We see the physical fallout of this in 2 Samuel 24, with King David's military census. David's private decision to pridefully count his troops triggered a pestilence that killed 70,000 people across the nation. David himself recognized the federal dynamic of his office, asking God why the sheep had to suffer for the actions of their shepherd. Power amplifies spiritual consequence. A leader's transgression creates a systemic blast radius for the entire covenant community. Because the risk is so high, the community is required to use a specific defense mechanism, peer accountability. Every member is obligated to actively investigate and purge hidden sin to protect the character of God dwelling in their midst. We see this process in action in Joshua 7. Joshua systematically casts lots, narrowing the search from tribes to families until Achan is exposed before the whole nation. This is the enforcement of the sanctions found in Deuteronomy 28. Active obedience ensures divine presence, while a breach triggers defeat. This leads to the absolute resolution in the Valley of Achor, the execution of Achan to remove the unholiness from the camp. This level of severity often causes modern discomfort. Why does the text present a God who demands this kind of public destruction? Within the law, this is pedagogical judgment. It is designed to be a structural, educational deterrent. Witnessing this judgment instills a sacred fear. It defines the boundaries of holiness for the surviving community, protecting them from a similar fate. Under the strict logic of the law, public judgment is an act of preservation for the nation. But the deterrent of Achan eventually failed. By the 8th century BCE, during the time of Hosea, the nation reached a point of systemic failure. After centuries of unfaithfulness, Israel faces the Assyrian Empire. The divine protection is gone, and the nation is headed for exile. This raises a logical problem. If the law required Achan's death for a single theft, then national unfaithfulness should mean the total end of the people. How can anyone survive this judgment? The survival of any Israelite suggests a layer of the covenant that judgment didn't extinguish. It points to the distinction Paul later clarifies in Romans 9, that within the visible nation there exists an invisible, elect remnant. When national judgments like the exile sweep the land, this remnant suffers the physical trauma alongside the rest of the nation. But for them, these hardships are not retributive wrath. They are acts of fatherly discipline, used to refine the heart rather than destroy it. God's temporal discipline purifies the chosen without ever canceling his eternal favor. This brings us back to Hosea 2 and the promise of a new exodus. God chooses to restore them in the Valley of Achor, the very site of their first catastrophic failure under Joshua. While the Old Covenant relied on human effort, the New Covenant is driven by God's sovereign grace. He leads them into the wilderness specifically to win them back. Here, the paradox of Achor is resolved. The law in Joshua 7 shows that human failure leads inevitably to the Valley of Trouble. But Hosea 2 shows that God's grace is capable of rewriting that failure. God never lowers the standard of holiness, but through sovereign grace, he uses discipline to transform the exact site of disaster into an unbreakable door of hope for his elect.